Chapter 1. Threads of an Unseen Tapestry. The sun rose sluggishly over the quiet town of Laurelbrook, casting its tender light over rooftops and gardens that seemed to have forgotten the brilliance of spring. Winter had lingered long that year, leaving behind an aching stillness in the hearts of those who called the town home. Among them was Evelyn Marchand, a woman who moved through life as if she were an unwelcome guest in her own story. Evelyn's days were a patchwork of routine and resignation. The mornings were for tending to her small garden, which stubbornly refused to bloom, as though the soil shared in her quiet despair. Afternoons were spent at the local library, where she worked amidst forgotten stories and unread pages. Her evenings, however, belonged to the ticking clock in her modest apartment, a rhythm that marked time but never truly moved it forward. The world around her seemed content with its quiet hum, yet Evelyn felt the vibrations of something more, a thread pulling at the edges of her consciousness. It wasn't a memory or a dream, but rather an absence, a hollow note in the symphony of her existence. She often dismissed the feeling, but it lingered, like an unfinished sentence waiting to be completed. On this particular morning, the sensation was stronger than ever. As she stepped into the crisp air, the wind carried with it the faintest scent of lavender, a fragrance that did not belong to her garden. Evelyn paused, her hands gripping the coarse fabric of her cardigan as she scanned the horizon. There was nothing unusual to see, only the frost-kissed lawn, the sagging fence, and the skeletal trees that bordered her small property. Yet the air felt alive, charged with a presence she could not name. Her thoughts wandered as she walked toward the gate, the gravel crunching softly underfoot. Beyond her garden lay the town square, its cobblestones wet with dew and its shops just beginning to open. A bakery's chimney puffed out tendrils of smoke, promising the warmth of fresh bread and coffee. Evelyn passed by without stopping, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. The lavender scent followed her, subtle but insistent, weaving itself into her thoughts like a persistent thread. By the time she reached the library, the sun was higher, and the square had come to life with its usual quiet bustle. Evelyn unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar aroma of aged paper and varnished wood. She took comfort in the order of her surroundings, the neatly stacked books, the polished countertops, the soft light streaming through stained glass windows. Yet even here, the thread tugged at her, pulling her attention toward the far corner of the room. It was an unremarkable corner, occupied by a single armchair and a small table piled with donated books awaiting cataloging. But today, the space felt different, as if it held its breath in anticipation. Evelyn hesitated, then crossed the room, her footsteps muffled by the worn rug. Among the pile of books lay a small journal, its leather cover cracked with age. She picked it up, her fingers brushing over the embossed initials on the front, A.T. The journal's weight was disproportionate to its size, as though it carried more than its pages could hold. Evelyn opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with looping handwriting that danced across the paper in a language she didn't recognize. The ink was faded but legible, and the words seemed to pulse with a life of their own, drawing her deeper into their mystery. Though she couldn't read the text, the journal stirred something within her, a flicker of recognition, like the half-remembered notes of a forgotten song. It felt intimate, personal, as if it were speaking directly to her. Evelyn closed the journal abruptly, her pulse quickening. She slipped it into her bag, unsure of why she felt the need to take it, but unable to leave it behind. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The library's patrons came and went, their faces a haze of polite smiles and murmured greetings. Evelyn performed her tasks on autopilot, her mind returning again and again to the journal hidden in her bag. When the clock struck 6, signaling the end of her shift, she locked up the library and made her way home. the journal's weight pressing against her side with every step. That night, as the world outside her window surrendered to darkness, Evelyn sat at her small kitchen table with the journal before her. The lavender scent lingered, stronger now, as though it had seeped into the very pages of the book. She opened it again, her fingers trembling. This time, the words seemed clearer, as if they had been waiting for her to return. The hours slipped away unnoticed as Evelyn pored over the pages, her heart racing with each turn. Though she couldn't understand the language, the journal's essence spoke to her. A tale of longing and loss, of connections forged and broken, of threads that bound lives together across time and space. It was a story she felt she had always known, though she couldn't explain how or why. As the first light of dawn crept through her curtains, Evelyn closed the journal and rested her hands on its cover. The threads of her life, once tangled and frayed, now seemed to hum with purpose. She didn't know what the journal would reveal or where it would lead her, but for the first time in years, she felt alive. The unseen tapestry of her existence was beginning to take shape, and she was ready to follow its threads, wherever they might lead. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Storm. The following day arrived cloaked in a somber gray, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Evelyn woke to the sound of wind rattling her windows, a low and persistent hum that seemed to echo the unsettled rhythm of her thoughts. She had barely slept, her mind consumed by the enigmatic journal resting on her bedside table. Its presence felt like a silent companion, as though it were waiting for her to unlock its secrets. She rose with deliberate slowness, her body aching with the weight of unanswered questions. The scent of lavender still lingered faintly in the air, though she had no source for it. It seemed to cling to her skin, her clothes, even the pages of the journal. It was a mystery she could not ignore, though it felt as much a comfort as a puzzle. After dressing in a plain sweater and jeans, Evelyn prepared a simple breakfast of toast and tea. The routine steadied her, anchoring her to the tangible world even as her thoughts drifted. She ate in silence, her gaze fixed on the journal, its cracked leather cover gleaming faintly in the dim morning light. The embossed initials AT seemed to glow with a quiet intensity, as though they held an identity just out of her reach. The storm began in earnest as she finished her meal, rain lashing against the windows with ferocity. The town of Laurelbrook, so peaceful in its daily rhythm, now seemed shrouded in an uneasy stillness. The streets outside her apartment were empty, the usual morning bustle replaced by the steady drumbeat of rain and the occasional groan of the wind. Evelyn placed the journal in her bag once again, her instincts urging her to bring it with her to the library. It felt wrong to leave it behind, as though it belonged not to her apartment, but to the very fabric of her life. She donned her raincoat and stepped out into the storm, her umbrella struggling against the wind as she made her way down the slick cobblestone streets. The library was nearly deserted when she arrived, save for the faint sound of water dripping from the eaves and the creak of the old wooden door. The familiar scents of paper and varnish greeted her, grounding her in their quiet permanence. Evelyn hung her coat and umbrella by the entrance, shaking off the cold before settling into her usual tasks. But the journal's presence weighed heavily on her. It sat in her bag beneath the counter, its pull as insistent as the storm outside. By mid-morning, she could resist it no longer. She retrieved the journal and carried it to the corner table where she had first found it, as though returning it to its rightful place. There, beneath the warm glow of the library's lamps, she opened it once more. The pages seemed different today. The faded ink, once difficult to decipher, appeared bolder, the looping script almost alive. Evelyn traced her fingers over the words, feeling a strange energy radiating from them. Though she still couldn't read the language, the shapes of the letters were becoming familiar, as though they were imprinting themselves on her mind. She spent hours immersed in the journal, the storm outside fading into a distant murmur. The story it contained, though indecipherable, unfolded in her imagination like a series of vivid dreams. She saw flashes of a figure, a man, she thought, standing beneath a canopy of trees, his face obscured by shadow. She saw fields of wildflowers bending in the wind, their petals scattering like fragments of memory. She saw hands reaching out, their fingertips barely brushing before slipping away into darkness. The imagery was haunting and beautiful, a tapestry of emotion that left her breathless. She felt as though the journal were speaking to her, not in words but in feelings, impressions that resonated deep within her soul. It was a story she didn't understand yet couldn't escape, a narrative that seemed to entwine itself with her own. As the afternoon light dimmed, Evelyn closed the journal and leaned back in her chair, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She stared out the window at the rain-soaked streets, the reflections of street lamps shimmering like liquid gold. The storm had eased, but the sky remained overcast, a thick blanket of gray that seemed to press down on the town. For the first time, Evelyn felt an urge to seek answers beyond the journal. The initials AT seemed a breadcrumb trail, a thread leading her somewhere she couldn't yet see. She thought of the library's archives, the dusty shelves filled with records of Laurelbrook's history. Perhaps there was something there, some clue that could unravel the mystery of the journal's origins. With renewed determination, she returned the journal to her bag and made her way to the archives, a small room tucked away at the back of the library. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper and mildew, the shelves groaning under the weight of decades of forgotten documents. Evelyn flipped the switch on a flickering lamp and began her search, her fingers skimming over the spines of ledgers, directories, and scrapbooks. Hours passed as she sifted through the dusty volumes, her frustration mounting with each fruitless search. There was no mention of AT, no records that matched the initials or the style of the journal. Yet Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she was close to something, a truth hovering just beyond her grasp. As the library's closing hour approached, Evelyn reluctantly replaced the last book on the shelf and turned off the lamp. She felt a pang of disappointment, but also a spark of hope. The journal had found its way to her for a reason. Of that, she was certain. Its story was unfinished, its threads still waiting to be woven together. That night, as she walked home beneath the lingering drizzle, Evelyn felt a strange sense of calm. The storm had passed, but its whispers lingered, threading themselves through her thoughts. The journal's mysteries remained unsolved, but for the first time in years, she felt as though her life was part of something larger, an unseen tapestry whose patterns were only beginning to reveal themselves. Chapter 3. A Garden of Wilted Petals. The next morning broke with a tentative light, the storm's remnants lingering as mist that clung to the earth like a fragile veil. Evelyn woke with the strange clarity that often follows restless sleep, her thoughts sharp and focused despite the heaviness in her limbs. The journal rested on her nightstand, its presence a quiet sentinel in the dim morning light. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, as if her body knew it was stepping into the unknown. Outside her window, the garden stretched out in its usual state of quiet disarray. Flowers long dead, leaves scattered across the frosted ground. Evelyn had never had much success with plants, their care always eluding her despite her efforts. Yet today, the garden seemed different. Even in its wilted state, it appeared alive, humming with a faint energy she couldn't name. Drawn by a strange compulsion, she slipped into her coat and stepped outside. The air was cold, each breath a visible puff that mingled with the mist. Her boots crunched softly on the frost-covered ground as she wandered between the dormant flower beds. Lavender, once vibrant and fragrant, now lay in brittle stalks, their lifelessness a stark contrast to the scent that had haunted her since the journal appeared. Kneeling by the lavender, Evelyn ran her fingers over the dry stems, their texture rough and unyielding. She thought of the journal, its story weaving itself into her life like roots burrowing deep into the earth. The connection felt undeniable, as though the garden and the journal were two parts of the same enigma. Returning inside, Evelyn prepared herself for another day at the library. Her movements were brisk, purposeful, as though guided by an unseen hand. The journal went into her bag once more, its weight both comforting and disquieting. She couldn't explain why she needed it with her, only that leaving it behind felt like abandoning a part of herself. The streets of Laurelbrook were quieter than usual, the storm's aftermath leaving the town subdued. Evelyn walked quickly, her steps echoing on the damp cobblestones. The library loomed ahead, its old stone facade dark against the overcast sky. Inside, the air was warm, the familiar sense of paper and wood welcoming her into their embrace. The day passed in a strange haze, each task feeling like a prelude to something greater. Evelyn's mind was not on the books she cataloged or the patrons she assisted, but on the journal and the questions it posed. The initials AT repeated in her mind like a mantra, their meaning tantalizingly close yet maddeningly elusive. As the afternoon wore on, Evelyn found herself drawn once more to the corner table where the journal had first appeared. She placed it before her, its worn leather cover catching the soft glow of the library's lamps. Opening it, she let her fingers trace the faded script, the strange symbols now feeling almost familiar. Today, the journal's pages seemed more vibrant, the ink darker and the handwriting sharper. It was as though the book responded to her touch, revealing more of itself with each passing moment. She flipped through the pages slowly, pausing on an illustration that had not been there before. A delicate sketch of a garden, its flowers blooming in intricate detail. Lavender dominated the scene, its stems entwined with vines that formed a heart at the center. The image struck Evelyn with an intensity that left her breathless. It was her garden, transformed, alive, thriving in a way it had never been. The lavender stood tall and lush, its blossoms vibrant and full of life. Yet there was an otherworldly quality to the illustration, as though it depicted not reality but a memory, or perhaps a dream. Evelyn closed the journal and sat back, her mind racing. The garden had always been a source of quiet failure for her, its barren beds a reflection of her own inner emptiness. Yet the journal seemed to suggest otherwise, that beneath the surface, something was waiting to bloom. The idea filled her with a strange mix of hope and fear. Unable to shake the image from her mind, Evelyn left the library earlier than usual. She walked home quickly, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. The streets were quiet, the town wrapped in the stillness of a late afternoon. As she approached her garden, she paused, her breath catching in her throat. The lavender was blooming. The sight was impossible, yet there it was, a riot of purple blossoms swaying gently in the cold breeze. The transformation was not subtle. It was as though the garden had been touched by an unseen hand, its once dead plants now thriving with a vitality that defied explanation. Evelyn stepped closer, her heart pounding. The scent of lavender was overwhelming, intoxicating in its intensity. She knelt by the flower bed, her fingers brushing over the soft petals. They felt real, tangible, yet they carried the same otherworldly energy as the journal. It was as though the garden had awakened in response to the story, its life intertwined with the words on the page. That night, Evelyn sat by her kitchen table with the journal open before her. The garden's transformation filled her thoughts, its impossibility both thrilling and terrifying. She flipped through the pages again, searching for answers, for a clue that might explain what was happening. Her fingers paused on a page near the center of the journal. The text here was bold, the ink almost fresh, as though it had been written only moments ago. Beneath the words was another illustration, a heart entwined with vines, the same as in the earlier sketch. But this time, the heart was fractured, its pieces held together by delicate threads of gold. Evelyn stared at the image, her breath catching. The golden threads seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, their pattern intricate and deliberate. She felt as though the journal were speaking directly to her, its message clear even if its meaning was not. As the night deepened, Evelyn closed the journal and looked out at her garden, the lavender glowing faintly under the moonlight. The threads of her life were shifting, their patterns becoming clearer with each passing moment. The journal was more than a story. It was a guide, a map leading her to something she could not yet see. And for the first time in years, she felt ready to follow it. Chapter 4. The Eclipsed Heart. The morning dawned pale and cold, the sun hidden behind a veil of dense gray clouds. Evelyn awoke with a strange heaviness in her chest, her dreams lingering at the edges of her consciousness like shadows slipping through her fingers. She couldn't remember their exact details, only fleeting impressions of golden light, entwined vines, and the faint sound of laughter that wasn't her own. The sensation left her feeling unmoored, as though the boundary between waking and dreaming had blurred. The journal lay on her bedside table, its leather cover glowing faintly in the weak light filtering through her curtains. Evelyn reached for it instinctively, the motion as natural as breathing. She opened it to the last page she had studied, the image of the fractured heart and golden threads waiting for her like an old friend. The lines were sharp, the ink vibrant, and she could almost feel the texture of the golden filaments beneath her fingertips. Her gaze drifted to the garden outside her window. The lavender was still in bloom, its rich purple blossoms standing in defiance of the season. A thin layer of frost coated the ground, yet the plants seemed untouched by the cold, their petals glistening as though kissed by dew. It was beautiful and unnatural, a reminder of the growing connection between the journal and her life. Evelyn dressed quickly, her thoughts racing as she prepared for another day. The journal went into her bag, its weight a familiar presence against her side. She had decided to spend her free hours in the library's archives again, convinced that the key to unraveling the mystery lay hidden within those dusty volumes. The initials AT haunted her, a riddle begging to be solved. The walk to the library was brisk, the crisp air biting at her cheeks and filling her lungs with icy clarity. Laurelbrook was quiet this morning, the streets nearly empty save for the occasional shopkeeper sweeping away leaves or tending to their storefront. The storm had stripped the trees bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky like supplicant hands. Inside the library, warmth and quiet enveloped her, a stark contrast to the chill outside. Evelyn wasted no time in making her way to the archives, her bag clutched tightly against her body. The room felt different today, its shadows deeper, its silence more profound. The air seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She began her search methodically, pulling down one volume after another and scanning their pages for any mention of AT or anything resembling the journal's enigmatic symbols. Hours passed in a blur of yellowed paper and faded ink, her frustration mounting as each book yielded nothing of use. Yet she pressed on, driven by an unshakable certainty that the answers she sought were close. It was late afternoon when she found it, a thin, weathered ledger tucked away on a high shelf, its cover nearly obscured by dust. Evelyn's hands trembled as she opened it, the brittle pages crackling softly under her touch. The handwriting inside was delicate and precise, reminiscent of the script in the journal. Her heart leapt as her eyes landed on the name she had been searching for, Arthur Thorne. The entry was brief, almost maddeningly so. It listed Arthur Thorne as a resident of Laurelbrook nearly a century ago, describing him as a reclusive artist known for his intricate sketches of nature. The details were sparse, offering little beyond his name and a single line that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. His work, though beautiful, was said to carry a strange power, a gift and a curse intertwined. The phrase echoed in her mind, resonating with the imagery from the journal. The garden, the lavender, the golden threads, they all felt like pieces of Arthur Thorne's legacy, fragments of a story that had somehow found its way into her life. She read and reread the entry, committing every word to memory before carefully replacing the ledger on the shelf. That evening, as she walked home, the sky darkened with the approach of another storm. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something faint and sweet, like lavender. Evelyn quickened her pace, her heart pounding with a mixture of exhilaration and unease. Back in her apartment, she placed the journal on her kitchen table and lit a single candle, its flickering light casting shadows that danced across the walls. She opened the journal to a random page, the text seeming to shimmer in the dim light. This time, the words didn't feel entirely foreign. She couldn't explain it, but she began to sense their meaning, not through understanding the language, but through the emotions they evoked. The story within the journal unfolded before her like a dream. It spoke of a man consumed by his art, his sketches so vivid they seemed to breathe with life. His most treasured creation was a garden, a sanctuary of beauty and magic that defied the natural order. But the garden came at a cost, its vitality draining the artist's own life force with each passing day. The golden threads in the journal seemed to symbolize the delicate balance between creation and destruction, love and sacrifice. Evelyn closed the journal, her mind spinning with the implications. Arthur Thorne's story felt intertwined with her own, their lives separated by time but connected by something deeper, something eternal. She glanced out the window at her garden, the lavender glowing faintly in the gathering darkness. The storm had arrived, rain pelting the glass and wind whipping through the trees. For the first time, Evelyn felt the weight of her choices. The journal had brought beauty and mystery into her life, but it had also opened a door to something she couldn't fully comprehend. As she sat by the candlelight, the shadows deepened around her, their shapes shifting into forms that seemed almost alive. And in the distance, she thought she heard the faintest echo of a voice, a whisper carried on the wind, calling her name. Chapter 5. Threads of Fate. The storm lingered throughout the night, a relentless symphony of rain and wind that seemed to shake the very foundations of Laurelbrook. Evelyn lay awake, her thoughts a tangled web of fear and fascination. Every creak of the old apartment, every gust that rattled the windows, felt imbued with a strange, otherworldly significance. It was as though the storm itself carried the weight of the journal's secrets, urging her to dive deeper into its mysteries. When morning came, it brought a heavy stillness. The rain had stopped, leaving the world drenched and glistening under a sky of muted gray. Evelyn rose from her bed, the journal still on her bedside table, its presence commanding as ever. She traced her fingers over its leather cover, her pulse quickening at the thought of what new revelations might await within its pages. The garden outside her window was untouched by the storm's fury. The lavender remained in full bloom, its vibrant purple a stark contrast to the sodden earth surrounding it. The sight filled her with a mixture of wonder and unease. It was as though the garden existed in a realm apart, bound by laws that did not apply to the rest of the world. Evelyn dressed quickly, her movements brisk and efficient despite the unease that lingered in her chest. She had decided to return to the archives, convinced that more clues about Arthur Thorne and the journal's origins lay hidden within the library's forgotten records. The weight of the journal in her bag was both a comfort and a burden, its secrets pressing against her mind like a physical force. The streets of Laurelbrook were eerily quiet as she made her way to the library. The storm had left the town in a state of hushed anticipation, its residents moving through the morning with cautious steps. Evelyn kept her head down, her thoughts focused on the task ahead. The library loomed before her like a sanctuary, its doors promising answers even as they guarded their secrets. Inside, the air was warm and still, the scent of old paper and wood enveloping her like a familiar embrace. Evelyn made her way to the archives with a sense of purpose, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty corridors. The room felt different today, its shadows deeper, its silence more profound. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though she knew she was alone. She began her search where she had left off the previous day, pulling down volumes and leafing through their pages with practiced efficiency. The name Arthur Thorne appeared sporadically, each mention adding another piece to the puzzle. He had been an artist of some renown, his sketches celebrated for their beauty and detail. Yet there were whispers of something darker, rumors of his work possessing a strange, almost supernatural power. Evelyn's fingers paused on a particular entry, her breath catching as she read the words before her. It described an exhibit held in Laurelbrook nearly a century ago, featuring Thorne's most celebrated piece, a sketch titled The Garden Eternal. The description was brief but evocative, speaking of a drawing so lifelike it seemed to pulse with vitality, its flowers appearing to bloom on the page. The exhibit had been abruptly closed, the piece disappearing without explanation. Her thoughts raced as she considered the implications. The garden in the journal, with its lavender and golden threads, felt inextricably linked to the garden eternal. It was as though the sketch had transcended its medium, becoming a living entity that now inhabited her world. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying, a reminder of the thin line between creation and destruction. As the day wore on, Evelyn's search took on a frantic pace. She scoured the archives for any mention of the sketch's fate, but the trail grew cold. Frustration and fatigue settled over her, the weight of unanswered questions pressing heavily on her chest. She returned the last volume to its shelf with a sigh, her hands trembling from the effort. Outside, the light was beginning to fade, the sky painted in shades of dusky gold and deepening gray. Evelyn left the library with a heavy heart, the journal clutched tightly against her side. The streets were bathed in the soft glow of street lamps, their reflections shimmering in the puddles that dotted the cobblestones. She walked slowly, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Back at her apartment, she placed the journal on the kitchen table and lit a single candle, its flickering flame casting long shadows on the walls. She opened the journal to the center, her eyes drawn once more to the illustration of the fractured heart. This time, the golden threads seemed to glow faintly, their intricate pattern pulsing with a life of its own. As Evelyn stared at the image, she felt a strange pull in her chest, as though the threads were reaching out to her, binding her to their story. She flipped the page, revealing a new illustration that hadn't been there before. A pair of hands, delicate and graceful, holding a single bloom of lavender. The detail was exquisite, the lines so precise they seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. Beneath the image was a single line of text, written in the same elegant script as the rest of the journal. Evelyn couldn't read the words, but their meaning resonated within her, a whisper at the edge of her consciousness. She closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her, the weight of the journal's secrets pressing against her mind like a tide. That night, Evelyn dreamt of a garden bathed in golden light, its flowers blooming in perfect harmony. She walked among the blossoms, their fragrance intoxicating, their colors impossibly vivid. At the center of the garden stood a figure, a man with kind eyes and hands stained with ink. He smiled at her, his presence both familiar and enigmatic. When she awoke, the dream lingered, its details etched into her memory with startling clarity. The journal sat on her bedside table, its leather cover cool to the touch. Evelyn picked it up, her heart racing as she opened it to the illustration of the hands holding lavender. The golden threads had changed. They now extended beyond the heart, weaving their way through the pages like veins, their delicate lines shimmering in the morning light. Evelyn traced them with her fingers, her pulse quickening as she realized the threads formed a map, a guide leading her deeper into the story, into the mystery that was Arthur Thorne and the garden he had created. For the first time, Evelyn felt a glimmer of understanding, a sense that the journal was not just a record but a living thing, its purpose entwined with her own. The threads of fate were pulling her forward, their path both inevitable and unknown, and she was ready to follow. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Quiet. The morning was muted, its light filtered through a thick canopy of gray clouds. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, the journal open before her, its pages alive with the shimmering network of golden threads. They wound their way across the illustrations and text, forming intricate patterns that seemed to breathe with an energy of their own. Each thread pulsed faintly, like veins carrying some unseen lifeblood through the ancient book. Evelyn traced the paths of the threads with her eyes, her mind racing to make sense of the patterns. They converged and diverged in a rhythm that felt deliberate, as though they were guiding her towards something hidden within the journal's pages. At the center of it all was the illustration of the fractured heart, its golden filaments now reaching beyond the confines of the page, stretching toward the edges of the book as if seeking escape. She couldn't ignore the sensation building in her chest, a pressure that grew stronger with each passing moment. It was as though the journal was alive, its secrets pressing against her consciousness, demanding to be uncovered. Evelyn turned the pages carefully, following the threads as they wove their way through the text and illustrations. Each page revealed new imagery, sketches of flowers and vines, landscapes that seemed both familiar and otherworldly, and symbols that defied her understanding. One image stopped her cold. It was a depiction of a doorway, its frame overgrown with ivy and lavender, the golden threads entwined around the plants like living tendrils. The doorway stood open, revealing only darkness beyond its threshold. Beneath the image was a single line of text, written in the same elegant, flowing script that filled the rest of the journal. Though she couldn't read the words, their presence filled her with a deep, inexplicable sense of foreboding. Evelyn closed the journal abruptly, the weight of its mysteries pressing down on her like a physical burden. She stood and moved to the window, her gaze drawn to the garden outside. The lavender was as vibrant as ever, its blossoms swaying gently in the breeze. The sight was comforting, yet it carried an edge of unease. The garden felt connected to the journal in ways she couldn't yet comprehend, as though it were an extension of the strange, golden world contained within its pages. Her thoughts turned to Arthur Thorne, the reclusive artist whose life seemed to be entwined with her own. The more she learned about him, the more she felt his presence lingering at the edges of her reality, like a shadow that couldn't be banished. His story was unfolding before her, its threads weaving through time to bind her to his legacy. Evelyn decided she couldn't remain idle. The journal had guided her to the archives before, and now it seemed to be pointing her towards something even greater. She gathered her things and stepped out into the crisp morning air, the journal tucked securely under her arm. Her steps carried her toward the outskirts of Laurelbrook, her destination unclear, but her resolve unwavering. As she walked, the town seemed to fade around her, its familiar streets giving way to a landscape that felt strangely altered. The trees stood taller, their branches intertwined like the threads in the journal. The air grew heavier, the scent of lavender mingling with the earthy aroma of damp soil. Evelyn felt as though she were stepping into another world, a place that existed parallel to her own yet operated under entirely different rules. She came upon a path she didn't recognize, its entrance marked by an arch of twisted branches, The arch was adorned with lavender blossoms, their purple hue vibrant against the muted tones of the forest. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The doorway from the journal flashed in her mind, its ivy-clad frame a mirror of the arch before her. With a deep breath, she stepped through the arch, the world shifting around her as she crossed the threshold. The air grew warmer, the light softer, as though filtered through a golden haze. The path wound deeper into the forest, its edges lined with flowers that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Evelyn followed the trail, her senses heightened, every sound and movement magnified in the stillness. The path led her to a clearing, its center dominated by a massive tree whose trunk was knotted with golden vines. The tree's branches stretched skyward, their tips disappearing into the haze above. At its base was a small stone pedestal, atop which sat an object that made Evelyn's breath catch in her throat. It was a sketchbook, its cover worn and faded but unmistakably familiar. The journal's twin. She approached the pedestal cautiously, her footsteps silent on the moss-covered ground. The sketchbook seemed to radiate an aura of warmth, its presence both inviting and intimidating. Evelyn reached out and touched its cover, her fingers tingling as though she had brushed against a live wire. The instant she made contact, the world around her shifted. The clearing dissolved into darkness, and Evelyn found herself standing in a space that defied comprehension. Golden threads filled the void, weaving an intricate web that stretched into infinity. At the center of the web was the fractured heart, its golden filaments pulsing with life. The threads connected to her, wrapping around her arms and legs, binding her to the heart's rhythm. Images flooded her mind. Arthur Thorne sketching in a sunlit studio, his hands moving with a precision that bordered on supernatural. The garden in full bloom, its flowers alive with an energy that seemed to defy the laws of nature. And the doorway, its darkness beckoning her forward. Evelyn awoke with a start, the clearing around her bathed in the soft light of evening. The sketchbook was still on the pedestal, untouched. She stared at it for a long moment before turning away, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. The journal's threads had brought her here, but they were not finished with her yet. Evelyn knew she was only at the beginning of a journey that would test the very fabric of her reality. The garden, the lavender, the golden threads, they were all part of a story that spanned lifetimes, a story that now included her. As she made her way back through the forest, the scent of lavender lingered in the air, a reminder of the path she had chosen. The threads of fate were pulling her forward, and Evelyn knew she had no choice but to follow where they led. Chapter 7. The Weight of Empty Promises. The days that followed Evelyn's journey to the clearing passed in a haze. The routine of Laurelbrook moved around her, a quiet hum of life she observed but no longer felt part of. Each morning she would rise with the light of dawn, the journal resting beside her bed like a sentinel. Its presence had become both comfort and curse, a bridge to a world she was only beginning to understand. The golden threads in the journal had shifted once again. Their paths, once limited to the illustrations, now extended across the blank spaces of the pages, creating intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with meaning. They wove symbols and shapes she couldn't decipher, but their arrangement carried a deep, almost musical rhythm. Evelyn often found herself staring at them for hours, her mind pulled into their flow as though entranced. It was during one of these trances that Evelyn noticed something strange. One of the golden threads extended off the edge of a page, as if escaping the confines of the journal. It was faint but unmistakable, and her breath caught as she reached out to touch it. Her fingers tingled as they brushed against the shimmering line, and a sudden, sharp image filled her mind. A darkened room, its walls lined with bookshelves, and at its center, a figure standing before a desk, their face obscured. The image dissolved as quickly as it had come, leaving Evelyn breathless and disoriented. She stared at the journal, its pages silent and unmoving, as though mocking her for seeking answers it wasn't ready to give. But she knew the vision was no accident. The threads were guiding her, revealing fragments of a larger story that demanded her attention. Evelyn decided to leave the apartment, her chest tight with the need to act. She had grown accustomed to the strange weight of the journal in her bag, its presence grounding her even as it pushed her further into the unknown. The streets of Laurelbrook were alive with the quiet bustle of its residents, but Evelyn moved through them like a shadow, her focus fixed on the path ahead. The library had become her sanctuary, its archives a labyrinth of forgotten knowledge she was determined to uncover. She made her way there with steady purpose, her mind replaying the vision from the journal. The room, the bookshelves, the figure. It all felt achingly familiar, as though it belonged to a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Inside the library, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of aging paper. Evelyn navigated the aisles with practiced ease, her footsteps soft against the polished wood floors. She returned to the archives, her fingers brushing against the spines of dusty volumes as she searched for something, anything that might shed light on the journal's origins. Her search was methodical, each book a potential key to the mystery that consumed her. She came across a volume detailing local legends, its pages filled with tales of lost artifacts and cursed relics. One story caught her eye, a fragment of folklore about a golden thread said to connect the living to the realm of the unseen. The thread was described as a bridge between worlds, its origins shrouded in myth but its power undeniable. The account was brief, its details frustratingly vague, but it stirred something deep within Evelyn. She closed the book and leaned back, her mind spinning with possibilities. The golden threads in the journal felt more significant than ever, their presence an echo of the ancient legend. But what did it mean for her? Was she merely a witness to the journal's story, or was she an unwitting participant in a tale that spanned centuries? As the afternoon wore on, Evelyn's search yielded little else of value. She returned the books to their shelves, her movements slow and deliberate. Outside, the sky had darkened, the approaching twilight casting long shadows across the town. Evelyn left the library with a sense of unease, the weight of unanswered questions pressing heavily on her shoulders. The streets were quieter now, the fading light giving them an otherworldly quality. Evelyn walked without direction, her thoughts a tangled web of fear and fascination. She found herself drawn to the outskirts of Laurelbrook, where the town gave way to open fields and dense woods. The path she had discovered days earlier loomed ahead, its arch of lavender still vibrant despite the fading season. Evelyn hesitated, her heart pounding as she considered the choice before her. The journal had led her here once before, its threads weaving a path into the unknown. But this time felt different. The vision of the darkened room lingered in her mind, its shadows beckoning her forward. With a deep breath, Evelyn stepped through the arch. The air grew heavier, the golden haze from before now tinged with a faint darkness. The path wound deeper into the forest, its edges lined with flowers that seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light. Evelyn walked cautiously, her senses heightened, every sound and movement amplified in the stillness. The clearing appeared before her, unchanged yet imbued with an energy she hadn't noticed before. The massive tree at its center seemed to pulse with life, its golden vines glowing faintly in the growing darkness. The pedestal still held the sketchbook, its presence both inviting and foreboding. Evelyn approached the pedestal, her steps slow and deliberate. She reached out to touch the sketchbook, her fingers trembling as they brushed against its cover. The moment her skin made contact, the world around her shifted. The golden haze dissolved into darkness, and Evelyn found herself standing in the room from her vision. The air was thick with the scent of old books and something sharper, almost metallic. The bookshelves loomed around her, their spines gleaming faintly in the dim light. At the center of the room was the figure from her vision, their back turned as they hunched over the desk. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she took a step closer, her breath catching in her throat. The figure turned, their face obscured by shadows, but their presence was undeniable. They reached out, their hand extending toward Evelyn. In their grasp was a single golden thread, its light pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Evelyn felt an overwhelming pull, as though the thread were calling to her, binding her to its will. Before she could react, the vision shattered, and Evelyn was back in the clearing. The pedestal was empty, the sketchbook gone. The air around her felt charged, the golden vines on the tree glowing brighter than ever. Evelyn knew the journal had taken her deeper into its story, revealing another piece of the puzzle. The threads of fate were drawing her closer to a truth she couldn't yet comprehend. She left the clearing with a sense of purpose, the weight of the journal in her bag a constant reminder of the journey ahead. As she walked back toward Laurelbrook, the shadows seemed to follow her, their presence a silent promise of the challenges yet to come. The threads of gold had bound her to their story, and Evelyn knew there was no turning back. Chapter 8. The Lull of Forgotten Echoes. The nights had become longer in Evelyn's world. Sleep came in fleeting whispers, fragmented and unmoored, as though her body refused to surrender to the quiet darkness. The journal remained her ever-present companion, its pages alive with golden intricacies that seemed to shift with every glance. The air in her apartment felt heavy, charged with the echoes of something unseen but undeniably there. On one such restless night, Evelyn found herself unable to resist the pull of the journal. The pages seemed to call to her, the golden threads glowing faintly in the dim light of her bedside lamp. She opened the book carefully, her fingertips grazing the edges of the paper as she turned to the latest pattern that had emerged. This time, the threads formed a circular design, almost like the cross-section of a labyrinth, with a singular point of origin spiraling outward into infinite complexity. At the center of the design was a small illustration, a simple key, its shape elegant yet unassuming. Evelyn stared at it, her mind drawn into the delicate lines and curves. The key seemed to shimmer faintly, its golden outline pulsing as though it were alive. She felt a strange pull in her chest, as though the journal were reaching out to her, urging her to uncover its secrets. The restlessness within her grew unbearable. Evelyn knew she couldn't stay confined within the walls of her apartment any longer. She dressed quickly, the journal tucked securely under her arm, and stepped out into the cool night air. Laurelbrook was quiet, its streets bathed in the pale light of a waning moon. The town felt different at night, its familiar landmarks shrouded in shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with a life of their own. Evelyn's footsteps carried her toward the outskirts of town, her path guided more by instinct than conscious thought. The journal's presence in her bag felt heavier with each step, as though it were leading her toward something she couldn't yet comprehend. The night was still, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, subtle yet unmistakable, a reminder of the garden that seemed to follow her everywhere. The path through the woods appeared before her, its entrance marked by the same arch of lavender she had passed through days earlier. This time, the arch seemed more vivid, its blossoms glowing faintly in the moonlight. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, before stepping through the arch. The forest beyond was alive with shadows, their forms shifting and dancing in the periphery of her vision. The trail wound deeper into the woods, its edges lined with flowers that seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't explain. Evelyn's footsteps were soft against the earth, her movements careful as she navigated the twisting path. She felt as though she were walking into a dream, the boundaries between reality and imagination blurring with each step. The path ended abruptly at the edge of a clearing, its center dominated by a structure she hadn't seen before. It was a small stone building, its walls covered in ivy and moss, as though it had been abandoned for centuries. The air around it was heavy, charged with the same energy that pulsed through the journal's pages. Evelyn approached cautiously, her pulse quickening as she reached the doorway. The door was ajar, its wooden frame weathered and splintered but still sturdy. Beyond the threshold was darkness, impenetrable and absolute. Evelyn hesitated, the weight of the journal in her bag a reminder of the path she had chosen. She stepped through the doorway, her breath catching as the world shifted around her. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, the darkness pressing against her like a living thing. Evelyn fumbled for her phone, its weak beam of light cutting through the shadows. The interior of the building was simple, its walls lined with shelves filled with books and objects she couldn't identify. At the center of the room was a table, its surface covered in papers, sketches, and fragments of what appeared to be golden thread. Evelyn approached the table, her eyes scanning the scattered objects. One sketch caught her attention, a detailed drawing of the key she had seen in the journal. Beside it was a map, its edges frayed and its surface marked with symbols she didn't recognize. The map seemed to depict the forest, its trails and landmarks rendered in intricate detail. At its center was a single mark, a small circle with the symbol of the key drawn inside. Evelyn's heart raced as she studied the map. The mark was located deeper within the woods, beyond the clearing where she now stood. The journal's threads had led her here, but it was clear her journey was far from over. She folded the map carefully and placed it in her bag, her thoughts a whirlwind of anticipation and dread. The room seemed to shift as she moved, the shadows pressing closer as though unwilling to let her leave. Evelyn felt a sudden chill, her breath visible in the cold air. The journal in her bag pulsed faintly, its presence a beacon of warmth in the oppressive darkness. She turned and made her way back to the doorway, her steps quickening as the weight of the building's energy grew heavier. Outside, the night was still and quiet, the moonlight casting long shadows across the clearing. Evelyn took a moment to steady herself, her mind racing with the implications of what she had found. The key, the map, the golden threads, they were all pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. As she made her way back through the forest, the scent of lavender grew stronger, its presence both comforting and unsettling. The journal's weight in her bag felt lighter now, as though it were content with the progress she had made. But Evelyn knew the journey ahead would only grow more challenging. The threads of fate were weaving a story far greater than her own, and she was bound to follow their path, no matter where it led. Laurelbrook emerged from the darkness, its familiar streets a stark contrast to the strange, otherworldly forest she had just left behind. Evelyn returned to her apartment, her mind filled with the echoes of the journal's secrets. She unfolded the map and placed it on the table, her eyes tracing the path that lay ahead. The shadows of the night whispered around her, their presence a constant reminder of the mysteries she had yet to uncover. Evelyn knew she couldn't turn back now. The golden threads had bound her to their story, and she was determined to see it through to its end. Chapter 9. The Pull of the Hidden Realm. The air was different that morning. It felt thicker, laden with the anticipation of something unseen yet inevitable. The sun rose slowly over Laurelbrook, casting long rays of light across the town, but Evelyn remained inside, her mind consumed with thoughts of the map, the key, and the labyrinth of golden threads that had begun to bind her more tightly with each passing day. The journal had not revealed its secrets easily, but Evelyn could feel that it was urging her towards something greater, something far beyond the boundaries of her quiet life in the town. The map she had discovered the night before lay open on her table. Its edges were worn, the ink faded in places, but the intricate symbols and markings seemed to pulse with a strange energy. The key that had been drawn at the center of the map was no longer just a symbol. It had become something real, something Evelyn could almost feel pressing against her chest with every breath. The more she studied the map, the more she realized the place it marked wasn't far from the clearing. It was deeper within the forest, in a section she hadn't yet explored. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The threads in the journal, the visions she had seen, the weight of the map, everything was pushing her toward that hidden place in the woods. The key, whatever it was the catalyst. Evelyn felt the urge to follow the path it pointed to uncover the truth behind the symbols, and to understand the power that had woven its way into her life. With a steady hand, she folded the map and placed it carefully into her bag. She couldn't help but notice how much lighter it felt now, as though each step toward the truth was shedding some of the heaviness that had been pressing down on her for so long. The journal, tucked into her bag beside the map, pulsed with a quiet hum of energy as if it, too, recognized the importance of the journey ahead. She left her apartment in silence, her footsteps light and purposeful as she moved through the waking town. The morning was quiet, the streets still damp with the remnants of the night's dew. The smell of fresh earth filled the air as she made her way toward the outskirts of Laurelbrook, where the forest stretched out like an untamed canvas. The Arch of Lavender was her first destination, the threshold that marked the boundary between the world she knew and the realm she was about to enter. The woods greeted her with a strange sense of familiarity, yet every step seemed to bring her deeper into the unknown. The path was narrow, the trees heavy with their own secrets, their branches reaching above like ancient guardians. Evelyn didn't question it anymore. The forest had become a part of her journey, its presence as much a guide as the journal she carried. The golden threads had connected her to something far beyond the mundane, something that transcended the boundaries of time and place. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the light began to change. The trees grew thicker, their canopy dense enough to block out the sun entirely. The air grew cooler, heavier, and the earthy scent of moss and damp leaves filled her lungs. Evelyn pushed forward, her determination unwavering despite the growing sense of unease. She had been here before, of course, but this time it felt different. The path felt more purposeful, the air more charged. The clearing came into view after what felt like hours of walking, but something about it was different now. Darker, more foreboding, as though it had been waiting for her arrival. The massive tree stood at the center, its golden vines twisting and curling around the trunk in an intricate dance. The golden haze that had once surrounded it was gone, replaced by an ominous stillness. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze drawn to the pedestal that stood in the clearing's center, though the sketchbook was no longer there. In its place was something else, something that resonated with an energy she hadn't felt before. Atop the pedestal rested a small box, its surface dark and weathered, its edges adorned with intricate carvings she hadn't noticed before. The key symbol from the map was etched into the box's lid, its shape unmistakable. A thrill ran through Evelyn's veins as she approached the pedestal. She had expected something, but not this. The box seemed to hum with a quiet power, as though it were waiting for her to unlock its secrets. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the surface. The moment her skin made contact with the box, the air around her seemed to crackle, a faint, electric buzz vibrating through her. With a steady breath, Evelyn lifted the box and opened it. Inside was a single object, a key, much like the one she had seen in the journal, its golden surface gleaming softly in the muted light of the clearing. It was smaller than she had imagined, delicate yet sturdy in her palm. The key pulsed with the same energy she had felt in the journal, as though it were alive in her hand. Evelyn stared at the key, her heart racing as she realized its significance. This was the key to the hidden realm the map had shown her. This was the key to understanding everything. She stood for a moment in the clearing, her mind spinning with the possibilities. The key was more than a mere object. It was a connection, a bridge between worlds. Evelyn could feel it deep within her, the pull of the key like a magnetic force drawing her toward the unknown. It was time to use it, to open whatever door lay ahead. But where? Where did it lead? A sudden impulse seized her, and she turned away from the pedestal, her eyes scanning the surrounding trees. The map had pointed to a location deeper within the woods. It had to be close. There had to be something else, something hidden, that would reveal the next step in her journey. With the key in her hand, Evelyn moved quickly, her steps no longer cautious but filled with purpose. She felt the shift in the air, the subtle change in the atmosphere as she pushed forward, as though the forest itself was reacting to her presence. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches creaking and groaning as if alive with the energy of her movements. And then, just as the weight of the forest seemed to press down on her chest, she saw it. A narrow opening between two towering oaks, the path winding beyond it shrouded in mist. The key in her hand pulsed, and the threads of gold in the journal seemed to stir in response. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, feeling the invisible force that had guided her thus far urging her on. The path ahead was unclear, its edges fading into the fog, but Evelyn knew she was on the verge of something monumental. The key was her guide, the journal her map, and with every step, she could feel herself drawing closer to the truth, closer to the hidden realm that awaited her on the other side. With the key clutched firmly in her hand, Evelyn disappeared into the mist. Chapter 10: Chasing Ghosts of Light. The air grew thicker as Evelyn ventured deeper into the mist, the path beneath her feet soft and uneven, almost as if the forest floor itself were shifting in rhythm with her every step. The key in her hand seemed to hum with a strange, pulsing energy, its golden surface warming in her grasp as she pressed on. There was no clear destination in sight, only the dim glow of the forest ahead, veiled in the fog that clung to the trees like ancient memories refusing to fade. Each step Evelyn took was met with an uncanny silence. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, the distant cry of animals, had disappeared entirely. There was no wind, no rustling of branches, no footsteps but her own. It was as though the world had been suspended in time, held in a breathless moment, waiting. The key in her hand was the only thing that seemed real in this fog, its presence grounding her to a reality she wasn't sure she fully understood. The mist clung to her skin, its cool tendrils wrapping around her as she continued down the path. The trees grew larger as she walked, their trunks gnarled and twisted, as if they had been standing here far longer than any forest she had ever seen. Their branches arched overhead like skeletal fingers, weaving a canopy that blocked out what little light there was. Evelyn had the distinct feeling that she was being watched, though she could see no eyes in the darkness. With each passing moment, the air seemed to grow more charged, a subtle energy prickling her skin, making her hair stand on end. The key, heavy in her hand, felt as though it were becoming a part of her, its golden threads entwining with the very fabric of her being. There was a sense of inevitability now. She was on a path she could not turn back from, drawn forward by forces she had only begun to comprehend. As she walked, the mist seemed to swirl around her, twisting in strange patterns that felt purposeful. Shapes began to form within the fog, faint and fleeting, only to dissolve as quickly as they appeared. They resembled faces, or perhaps memories, flitting in and out of her vision, each one more elusive than the last. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she realized the figures seemed familiar, as though they were echoes of something she had seen before, something long forgotten. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm, to keep moving. There was no time to question what was happening, only to continue. She had to find the truth. The key was leading her, and she had no choice but to follow. The mist thickened even further, swallowing her whole, until there was nothing but the soft glow of the golden key in her hand. And then, in the distance, she saw it, a faint, glowing light ahead. It flickered like a candle's flame, small but steady, beckoning her forward. The pull toward it was undeniable, as if the light itself was calling to her. She quickened her pace, drawn to it by something deep within her soul. The forest seemed to shift around her as she moved. The path became narrower, the trees more densely packed. The ground beneath her feet became uneven, as though she were walking across a landscape that was slowly being shaped and reshaped by unseen hands. The mist clung to her, damp and cold, but the light ahead remained her only focus. And then, as if from nowhere, the mist parted. Before her stood a vast structure, its towering silhouette emerging from the fog like a forgotten monument. The building was ancient, its walls weathered and cracked, but there was a strange beauty to it, a beauty that felt timeless, beyond the constraints of the world Evelyn knew. It was made of stone, but the stone itself seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow, reflecting the light of the key in her hand. The structure seemed to hum with life, its presence both familiar and foreign, as though it had always been here, hidden in plain sight. At the base of the structure was a massive door, its surface etched with intricate carvings and symbols that Evelyn recognized. The same symbols from the journal, the same markings that had appeared throughout her journey. The door was massive, imposing, its presence a silent invitation, but Evelyn hesitated. Something about it felt both alluring and terrifying, as if it held within it a power that was beyond her understanding. The key in her hand pulsed more urgently now, its golden light intensifying with each passing second. She knew, without a doubt, that this was the place the key had been leading her to all along. The door was the threshold, the point of no return, and the key was the means to unlock whatever lay beyond it. With a deep breath, Evelyn stepped forward. As her footfalls echoed in the silence, the door before her seemed to shift, its ancient hinges groaning in protest. The symbols etched into the door began to glow, their light shimmering with a strange rhythm. The key, now blazing with an almost blinding light, fit perfectly into the lock. Evelyn turned it, her heart racing, the weight of the moment heavy in her chest. And then, the door opened. The world beyond the threshold was a vast expanse of darkness, but as Evelyn stepped through, the shadows seemed to retreat, revealing an awe-inspiring sight. The space was unlike anything she had ever seen. An endless hall, its walls lined with mirrors, each one reflecting an image of herself. The mirrors weren't perfect, though. They were fractured, broken in places, their surfaces warped and distorted. Yet each one seemed to tell a story, capturing fleeting moments of her life in ways she hadn't remembered. The air inside the hall was thick with energy, and Evelyn could feel the weight of countless eyes upon her. The mirrors reflected not just her image, but something more, a part of her soul, a memory, a feeling she hadn't yet understood. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but there was no turning back now. This was the place where her journey would reach its culmination. Evelyn moved cautiously through the hall, her eyes flicking from mirror to mirror. Each step seemed to echo in the vast space, the sound reverberating against the walls as if the very building was alive, responding to her every move. The key in her hand had grown warm, almost unbearably so, as though it was reacting to the energy around her. She didn't know what she was meant to do next, but the pull of the key was undeniable. It was leading her, guiding her forward, and she followed. The mirrors shifted as she moved, their reflections growing more vivid, more detailed. The faces in them became clearer, their expressions more defined, and Evelyn realized with a start that they were all her own faces, different versions of herself at different points in time. The journey through the hall seemed to stretch on forever, the mirrors multiplying as if they were infinite. Yet Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that there was something just beyond the next corner, something that would finally unlock the mystery of the journal, the key, and the path she had been following for so long. The light of the key grew brighter still, its glow filling the space around her. The hall seemed to narrow, closing in on her, until only one final mirror remained at the far end of the chamber. This one was different. The reflection in it wasn't hers. Instead, it was the face of a man. A face she didn't recognize, yet somehow, in the deep recesses of her mind, she did. And as the key pulsed one final time, the mirror began to crack. Chapter 11. The Compass of the Heart. The crack in the mirror spread slowly, a jagged line that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if it were alive. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened, the thudding in her chest growing louder in the silence that had descended upon the hall. The mirror's surface rippled, distorting the face of the man reflected within it. His eyes, once calm and unblinking, now seemed to move, to watch her, drawing her in with an intensity that made her feel as though the mirror were reaching out, trying to pull her into its depths. The key in her hand was almost too hot to touch now. Its glow had intensified, flooding the hall with a bright, golden light. The walls of mirrors around her seemed to shimmer with a new energy, their reflections bending and warping, as if the very fabric of reality were beginning to unravel. The crack in the mirror widened, splintering the surface like a spider's web, and Evelyn could feel the force of it, an invisible pressure that seemed to tighten around her chest. She stepped closer, drawn to the shattered reflection, the urge to understand what it all meant overwhelming her. The man's face was still unfamiliar, yet there was something about him, something in his eyes, that stirred something deep within her. The fragments of the mirror seemed to pulse with his presence, as though they were connected, as though the man were trying to communicate something to her without words. Evelyn reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the surface of the mirror, her skin making contact with the shards. The moment her hand brushed against the glass, a sharp, electric jolt shot through her, a searing pain that left her breathless. It wasn't physical, not exactly. It was as though the shock had pierced her soul, connecting her to the broken reflection in a way she hadn't anticipated. The man's face twisted then, his features distorting in the fractured glass, but his eyes remained steady, locked onto hers. There was a deep sadness in them, a sorrow that seemed to seep through the cracks, spreading like a shadow across the hall. Evelyn felt it, felt the weight of that sadness pressing down on her, drowning her in an ocean of emotions she couldn't comprehend. And then, just as quickly as the connection had begun, it shattered. The mirror's surface exploded outward, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. Evelyn cried out, her hands instinctively protecting her face as the glass cut through the air. But the shards didn't fall to the floor. They froze, suspended in mid-air, their jagged edges gleaming with an ethereal glow. The pieces hovered in place, hovering around Evelyn like a swarm of fireflies, casting sharp, flickering shadows across the hall. The energy in the room intensified, the air growing thick with an electric charge. Evelyn felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, as though the entire hall was alive, reacting to her presence. The key in her hand was vibrating now, pulsing with such intensity that she had to grip it tighter, her knuckles white with the force. The shattered pieces of the mirror began to shift, rearranging themselves in mid-air. Slowly, deliberately, they moved, their edges aligning to form a new image, a new reflection. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the pieces clicked together, revealing not just the man's face, but something else, something far more unsettling. In the fractured image, she saw herself, but it wasn't her. It was another version of her, one that she didn't recognize, yet somehow, deep down, she knew was hers. The reflection in the glass was twisted, distorted, her eyes hollow and dark, her expression cold and empty. It was as though the woman in the mirror was someone else entirely, a shadow of the person she had once been. And yet, Evelyn felt an undeniable connection to this version of herself, as if the fractured reflection were calling out to her, beckoning her to understand. The pieces of the mirror continued to shift, rearranging again, this time into a scene. It was a place Evelyn had never seen before, an ancient temple, bathed in golden light. The walls of the temple were adorned with the same symbols that had appeared throughout her journey, the markings that had guided her to this point. At the center of the temple stood an altar, and on that altar lay a figure, cloaked in shadow, barely visible through the haze of golden light. The image in the mirror rippled, the figure on the altar slowly coming into focus. It was a man, his features obscured by the shadows, but Evelyn knew instantly who he was. It was the man from the shattered reflection. He was lying on the altar, his body motionless, as though he were waiting for something or someone. The mirrors around her shimmered again, and the image on the altar shifted, revealing the same figure, but this time, standing in front of a vast, open door. Beyond the door, Evelyn could see only darkness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. The man's hand reached out, gripping the door's handle, but he hesitated, as if unsure whether to step through or turn away. There was a sense of fear in his posture, a hesitation that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. And then, in the blink of an eye, the scene changed once more. The man was gone, replaced by a woman, her own face twisted in agony. She stood in front of the door, her hand resting on the handle. There was no hesitation in her now. She stepped forward, her foot crossing the threshold, and Evelyn felt a cold, sharp rush of wind as the door slammed shut behind her. The mirrors shattered again, the fragments flying in every direction, but Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't need to see the shards anymore. She understood. She understood what had been revealed to her, what the mirrors had shown her. The man, the woman, both were tied to her. The path she had been following was not just about uncovering some distant truth, some ancient power. It was about herself, about the fractured parts of her own soul. The man had been a reflection of her past, a part of her that had been lost. The woman in the mirror, the one who had stepped through the door, was a version of herself she feared becoming, a version that had been swallowed by the darkness, by whatever lay beyond that threshold. The key in her hand pulsed once more, its golden light now dimming, as though it had completed its task. The energy in the hall shifted, the mirrors fading into the shadows, their reflections dissolving into nothingness. The temperature dropped, and Evelyn could feel the weight of the decision that lay before her. She could turn back. She could leave this place, leave the hall of mirrors, and return to the life she knew. She could forget everything she had seen, leave behind the fragments of herself she didn't understand. But the door she had glimpsed in the mirror, remained, and Evelyn knew it was a door she had to open. There was no turning back. The man on the altar, the woman stepping into the darkness. These were the pieces of her story. The only way forward was to face them, to step through the door herself. With the key still pulsing in her hand, Evelyn took a deep breath. She stepped toward the door, ready to face whatever lay beyond it. The mirrors had shown her the truth, and now it was time to embrace it. Chapter 12: Ashes and Blossoms. The door loomed before Evelyn, its edges glowing with a faint golden light, beckoning her as if it were the last step in a journey that had already stretched beyond the limits of time and understanding. The Hall of Mirrors was behind her now, its reflections fading into the shadows, leaving only the soft hum of the key in her hand. It seemed to echo in the stillness of the space around her, a sound that reverberated through her very bones, urging her onward. There was no more hesitation, no more uncertainty. The path was clear. The door was all that remained. Evelyn stood before the threshold, the darkness beyond it swallowing the light of the hall, as though the void on the other side was hungry, waiting to consume whatever crossed its boundary. She could feel the cold air on the other side, seeping through the cracks, carrying with it a sense of finality. This was it. There was no turning back now. With a steadying breath, Evelyn reached out and grasped the handle of the door. The coldness of the metal sent a shiver up her spine, but the warmth of the key in her hand grounded her. Her fingers curled around the handle, and with a firm twist, the door creaked open, its ancient hinges groaning in protest. The sound reverberated in the stillness, a haunting melody that felt like the last song of a forgotten world. Beyond the door, there was only darkness. It was not the comforting kind of darkness, the kind that could be overcome with time or light. No, this was a profound emptiness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever, a place where even sound dared not exist. It was as though the universe itself held its breath, waiting for her to take the first step. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking to the glowing key still clutched tightly in her hand. Its light flickered, casting long shadows in every direction, but it wasn't enough to dispel the oppressive darkness ahead. She didn't know what lay beyond this threshold, what awaited her, what she would find once she crossed the divide. But she knew she had no choice. The door was a doorway not just into a different place, but into herself, into the last fragments of her soul that had yet to be discovered. With her heart beating loudly in her chest, Evelyn stepped forward. The air on the other side was heavy, thick with an energy that she could almost taste. It was ancient and strange, foreign in a way that made her skin prickle. As she crossed into the void, the darkness seemed to fold in around her, but it wasn't suffocating. It was enveloping, wrapping her in its cold embrace, guiding her deeper into whatever lay ahead. The key in her hand pulsed, its golden light dim but steady, lighting her path, though it barely reached beyond a few feet in front of her. There was a weight to the silence here, a heavy stillness that was both unnerving and soothing. The path beneath her feet felt strange. It wasn't solid, but neither was it unstable. It was as though the ground itself was breathing, shifting with each of her steps, as if the very fabric of this place was alive, responding to her presence. The further she walked, the more she could sense the faint, distant presence of something or someone. She couldn't explain it, but it felt as though she were not alone, though there was no sound, no motion. Time seemed to lose meaning as she moved forward. Every step was both an eternity and the briefest of moments. The darkness stretched on, endless, but Evelyn continued, driven by the pull of the key, by the invisible force that guided her through this silent world. She felt her resolve strengthening with each passing moment. There was a purpose to this place, a meaning that had eluded her until now, but she could feel it, deep in her chest, thrumming with her heartbeat. And then, ahead of her, she saw it, a faint light, just barely perceptible against the blackness. At first, it seemed like a mirage, an illusion conjured by her mind. But as she drew closer, the light became more solid, more real. It was a soft, ethereal glow, like the light of a distant star, flickering in the void. It was unlike the light of the key. It wasn't harsh or blinding. It was gentle, soothing, as though it had been waiting for her, just as she had been waiting for it. Evelyn's steps quickened as she approached the light, drawn to it by a force that was impossible to resist. The air around her began to change, the oppressive silence lifting, replaced by a soft hum, like the distant sound of wind through trees. The weight of the darkness around her seemed to lessen, as though the light was pushing it back, carving out a space where she could breathe again. The light grew brighter as she moved closer, revealing the shape it surrounded. It was a figure, cloaked in white, standing in the center of the glowing halo. The figure was still, unmoving, but there was something about it that felt both comforting and unnerving. Evelyn couldn't make out the details of the figure's face, only the soft, glowing outline, but she knew, instinctively, that this was what she had been searching for. This was the moment she had been drawn toward, the point at which everything converged. The key had brought her here, to this place, to this figure, to this light. But what did it all mean? What was she supposed to do now? As if answering her silent question, the figure in the light began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped forward, each movement fluid, almost ethereal. It was coming toward her, and Evelyn could feel the pull in her chest, as though the figure and the light were drawing her in, urging her to step forward, to meet them halfway. The closer the figure came, the more Evelyn could feel it. The energy, the presence. It wasn't just something external. It was something within her, something she had carried with her all along, buried deep inside. The light was not just a physical presence. It was a reflection of herself, a part of her soul that had been hidden, locked away until now. When the figure was close enough, it stopped. The silence returned, but it was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful, expectant. Evelyn could feel her heart steadying, the frantic thumping of her pulse settling into a slow, even rhythm. She could feel the warmth of the light now, not just in the air, but in her chest, filling her with a sense of calm, of understanding. The figure extended its hand, palm open, waiting for her to take it. The invitation was clear, but Evelyn hesitated. She knew what this meant. Taking the figure's hand would mean crossing the final threshold, embracing the last part of herself that she had been avoiding, the part that she had feared. But it was the only way forward. She knew it. With a steady breath, Evelyn stepped forward, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out. As her fingers brushed against the figure's hand, a rush of energy surged through her. It was overwhelming, a flood of light and warmth that filled her mind, her soul, every fiber of her being. In that moment, Evelyn understood. She understood what the key had been guiding her toward, what the door had opened. She understood that this place, this light, was not just a destination. It was a reconciliation, a merging of all the pieces of herself that had been broken, scattered, hidden. The figure was her. The light was her. And now, she was whole again. The energy that had once been alien now felt like an extension of herself, a part of her that had always been there, waiting for her to find it. She wasn't alone. She never had been. The light wasn't just a beacon in the darkness. It was the truth of who she was, who she had always been, waiting for her to see it. Evelyn took the figure's hand, and in that instant, everything shifted. The darkness, the void, the fear. It all faded, leaving only light, only peace. The world around her dissolved, replaced by something new, something more. And as she stood there, hand in hand with the light, Evelyn knew that she had crossed the final threshold. The journey had ended, but the truth had only just begun. Chapter 13. The Heart of the Storm. Evelyn awoke, though it was unclear whether she had truly slept. The world around her had changed, or perhaps it was she who had changed. The brilliance of the light still lingered, but it was softer now, diffused by the weight of the world she had returned to. The surroundings were no longer the endless darkness she had traversed, nor the ethereal glow of the figure. Instead, she stood on the edge of a vast, windswept plain. the ground beneath her feet solid and firm, yet strangely unfamiliar. The wind tugged at her hair, sweeping it across her face in gusts that felt colder than they should. The sky above her churned with an intensity she could hardly describe, clouds swirling in chaotic patterns as if the heavens themselves were in turmoil. The light that had once felt so warm and encompassing now seemed distant, like a memory fading away, leaving only the sense of its presence lingering in the air. Evelyn's heart pounded, an echo of the storm raging overhead. She had crossed through the door, through the darkness, into something that felt far removed from everything she had known. And yet, the deeper she ventured into this new reality, the more she understood that it was connected to everything. The storm above her mirrored the tumult within, a reflection of the conflict that had raged in her heart for so long. With every step she took, the ground beneath her seemed to shift and tremble, as though the world itself was on the brink of unraveling. The wind screamed in her ears, drowning out everything else. And yet, amid the chaos, Evelyn could feel a strange pull, a beckoning that seemed to guide her through the maelstrom. It wasn't a voice, there were no words, but there was an undeniable force urging her to move forward, to trust in the path that had been laid out before her. As she walked, the storm seemed to grow more intense, the clouds darkening with each passing moment. The winds howled louder, whipping around her with such force that it was difficult to keep her footing. But still, she pressed on. She could not explain it, but there was a sense of inevitability in her movements, a certainty that this journey, this test, was not just some external trial. It was a part of her, woven into the very fabric of her being, a continuation of the path she had begun long ago. Through the haze of wind and rain, Evelyn saw something in the distance, a flicker of light, distant but unwavering. It pulsed gently against the chaos of the storm, a beacon guiding her forward. It was not as blinding as the light of the figure, nor as soft, but it was a light nonetheless, a reminder that there was purpose beyond the tempest. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid but shifting, as though the very earth was struggling to hold itself together. The once familiar terrain had turned alien, its features distorted by the storm's fury. She could no longer tell where the earth ended and the sky began. The lines between them had blurred, as if the storm had merged the two into a single, chaotic whole. But Evelyn did not falter. She had come too far to turn back now. With each step, the storm seemed to push against her, testing her resolve. The wind howled with a sound that was almost like a voice, a wail of sorrow and anger, a cry of longing that reached deep into her soul. She could feel the storm trying to break her, to pull her back into the uncertainty she had just left behind. But Evelyn stood firm, her every fiber of being aligned with the path she had chosen. As she neared the light, the storm began to change. The winds shifted, growing less violent, as though they were clearing a path for her. The air grew thicker, and the ground beneath her feet steadied, no longer trembling as it had before. The distant flicker of light became more pronounced, taking shape before her eyes. It was not the figure she had encountered before, but something else, something more tangible, more immediate. And then, just as Evelyn thought she could not bear the weight of the storm any longer, the clouds parted. A brilliant ray of sunlight broke through the storm, casting a warm, golden glow that seemed to chase away the darkness and the fear. The winds stilled, the howling winds turning into a soft, almost melodic breeze. The ground beneath her feet was solid once again, the earth steady and firm. The storm had passed, leaving only the remnants of its fury, a distant rumble in the sky above. Before her now stood a vast, open field. The light from the sky poured down, illuminating the landscape with a gentle radiance. The air was still, as though the world itself had taken a breath, waiting for her to move. But Evelyn stood still for a moment, feeling the calm wash over her. She had crossed the storm, had faced the tempest both within and without, and now she was here, standing in the silence that followed. The storm had not been something to be defeated. It had been a test, a challenge, a necessary trial to help her see what she had not seen before. The chaos had been a mirror of her own heart, the conflict and turmoil that had raged within her for so long. The light, distant as it had seemed, had always been there, guiding her, urging her to push forward. Now, in the aftermath of the storm, she felt a peace she had never known before. The winds had calmed, the sky had cleared, and the light had returned. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sunlight wash over her. She didn't need to understand it all just yet. She didn't need to know what came next. For the first time in so long, she felt whole, at peace with herself and the world around her. The storm had been a necessary passage, but it was over now. As she opened her eyes, she saw the vast expanse before her. The light stretched endlessly across the horizon, beckoning her onward. The path ahead was clear now, unburdened by the chaos that had once clouded her vision. Evelyn took a step forward, the earth solid beneath her feet. And with each step she took, the world around her seemed to open up, full of possibility, full of hope. The storm had passed, and with it, the darkness that had once held her captive. She had crossed into a new realm, one where the light would guide her, where peace would reign, and where the heart of the storm could no longer touch her. And so, she walked, her heart steady and her spirit calm, ready for whatever came next. Chapter 14. The Symphony of a Fragile Hope. Evelyn stood at the edge of the field, the warmth of the sun still bathing her in its gentle glow. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in the depths of her soul. It was as though the wind had carved something new within her, a hollow space now filled with understanding, though the nature of it was still unclear. Every step she took felt like a new beginning, a fragile thread connecting her past, her present, and the vast unknown that awaited. Before her lay a forest, its trees tall and ancient, their branches interwoven in a delicate dance that seemed to whisper secrets only the earth could hear. The path into the woods was not clearly marked, but something deep within Evelyn stirred. An instinct, a pull that drew her toward it. There was a stillness in the air, a sense of timelessness, as though the forest existed outside of time itself, a place where the past and future converged into a single moment. The trees towered above her, their trunks wide and gnarled, roots curling out from the earth like ancient hands, reaching down into the very heart of the world. The leaves shimmered in the light, their edges touched by a faint, golden glow, as if they were alive with the energy of something greater. The forest seemed to breathe with her, each step she took resonating in the soil beneath her feet, as though the ground itself was alive, aware of her presence. Evelyn had always felt a connection to nature, an affinity for the quiet, subtle rhythms of the world. But this place, this forest, felt different. It was not merely nature. It was something sacred, something ancient. The roots beneath her feet were not just the life force of trees. They were the veins of the earth itself, pulsing with the energy of a world far older than she could comprehend. She walked deeper into the woods, the air growing cooler as the canopy thickened, the shadows lengthening with the approach of twilight. Yet there was no fear in her heart. The forest did not feel threatening. It was a presence, patient and unhurried. There was something gentle in the way the leaves rustled in the breeze, as if the forest was communicating with her in a language older than words. As she walked, the forest seemed to shift around her. The trees, once so uniform in their height and structure, now twisted and curled in different directions, their forms becoming more fantastical, more alive. The bark of the trees was etched with patterns that seemed to pulse with light, veins of gold running through the dark wood like the flow of blood. The roots beneath her feet grew thicker, more intertwined, until it felt as though the very ground was a living organism, wrapping around her, connecting her to something vast and eternal. There was a part of her that knew she had entered a space where time did not exist. The minutes and hours seemed to melt away as she walked deeper into the forest. The sky above was no longer just the sky. It was a part of the world around her, an infinite expanse that blended seamlessly into the trees. There was no separation between the earth, the sky, and the light. Everything was woven together into one vast, eternal tapestry. As she ventured further, Evelyn felt a shift in the air, a hum of energy that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the forest. It was as though the forest itself had a pulse, a rhythm that was both ancient and alive. She could feel it in the air, in the earth beneath her feet, in the very space between her breaths. The deeper she moved into the woods, the more she became attuned to this energy, this pulse of life that seemed to sustain everything around her. At the center of the forest stood a great tree, its trunk massive and its branches reaching high into the sky. The tree seemed to be the heart of the forest, its roots spreading deep into the earth, its branches touching the heavens. The leaves of the tree shimmered with a faint golden light, as if they held within them the knowledge of the ages. The tree was ancient, older than anything Evelyn had ever imagined, and it radiated a sense of wisdom and strength that was both humbling and awe-inspiring. Evelyn approached the tree, feeling a pull within her, a longing to be near it. As she drew closer, she could hear a soft murmur, like a voice carried on the wind. It was not a voice she could understand, but it felt familiar, comforting in its presence. She reached out to touch the tree, her hand resting gently on its bark. The moment her skin made contact with the tree, she felt a surge of energy flow through her, a powerful connection to something far greater than herself. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, the world around her blurred. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she found herself in a place she could not recognize. The trees were gone, replaced by a vast expanse of light. It was not the soft light of day, nor the harsh light of the storm. It was a pure, radiant light that filled every inch of the space around her. It was as though the very air was infused with light, and she was bathed in its glow. She could feel a presence here, a power that was beyond comprehension. It was not threatening, but it was overwhelming, as though she stood on the threshold of something profound. The light pulsed, and with each pulse, she felt her connection to the world around her deepen. She could hear the faintest whispers, voices carried on the wind, but they were not voices of fear or sorrow. They were voices of peace, of understanding, of ancient knowledge. The light seemed to be calling her, urging her to step forward. And so, without hesitation, she did. With each step, the light grew brighter, more intense, until it filled her vision completely. The world around her seemed to disappear, replaced by the pure radiance of this place. And then, in the heart of the light, Evelyn saw something. A figure, silhouetted against the glow. It was not a person, not a being she could identify, but it was familiar nonetheless. It was as though this figure was an extension of herself, a reflection of something deep within her heart. The figure moved toward her, its presence radiating warmth and understanding. Evelyn did not fear it. Instead, she felt a deep sense of connection, as though this figure had been with her all along. As the figure came closer, it seemed to dissolve, merging with the light, until it was no longer distinct from the radiance itself. And then, in that moment, Evelyn understood. The forest had not just been a place she had walked through. It had been a journey. The tree, the roots, the light. It was all a part of her, a manifestation of the deeper truths within her soul. She had come to this place to remember, to connect with the eternal, to understand that she was a part of something far greater than herself. With a deep breath, Evelyn closed her eyes, the light filling her once more. And when she opened them again, she was back at the heart of the forest, standing before the great tree. The world around her was the same, but she was no longer the same. She had been touched by something beyond comprehension, and the world before her now seemed richer, fuller, more alive with possibility. And so, with quiet resolve, Evelyn placed one hand on the tree once more, feeling its ancient wisdom flow through her. The roots of eternity had opened before her, and she was ready to continue her journey, to follow the path that had been laid before her, no longer as a stranger to herself, but as one who had glimpsed the infinite. With a final, steadying breath, she stepped forward into the next chapter of her journey, knowing that no matter where it led, she was never truly alone. Chapter 15. The Bridge Between Worlds. Evelyn stood before the ancient tree, her hand resting against its rough, weathered bark. The energy that had surged through her only moments ago still pulsed in her chest, a steady thrum that connected her to the very heart of the earth. She could feel the presence of the tree, the wisdom it held, as though the very ground beneath her feet was alive with untold stories, waiting to be shared. The forest around her seemed to breathe with her, as if it too had taken a collective, slow exhale. The air, once thick with mystery, now felt lighter, more breathable, as though the storm of emotions inside her had cleared. The chaotic turmoil of her past, the endless questioning, the disquiet. Somehow it all seemed distant now. The clarity that had been growing within her, like a seed unfolding its petals, had blossomed into something she could not ignore. She understood now that this was not just the end of a journey, but the beginning of something new. The tree before her seemed to hum with life, its branches reaching far into the sky, its roots burrowing deep into the earth, forming a vast network connecting all things. Evelyn could feel that same network extending outward from the tree, from the ground beneath her, through her own heart. It was as though everything was intertwined, an intricate web of energy that spanned beyond time and space. And in the center of this connection, Evelyn felt a pull, a call to move forward. The light, golden and soft, filtered through the canopy above, casting long shadows on the ground. It was a light that seemed to bend and shift with the very rhythm of the world around her, as if the sun itself was following the same patterns, the same unseen forces that she had felt within herself. The world felt delicate, like a fine thread, fragile but holding everything together in a way that felt both magical and tangible. As Evelyn turned away from the tree, ready to follow the path that stretched before her, she noticed something new. In the distance, beyond the forest's edge, there stood a bridge. At first, it seemed an illusion, an apparition of her mind. But as she focused, as she reached out with her senses, the bridge became more solid, more real. It was an old stone structure, its surface worn by centuries of weather, yet it stood firm and unyielding, stretching across a deep ravine. The bridge was suspended high above the chasm, its arch curving gracefully over the abyss. Evelyn knew, without fully understanding why, that this bridge was part of the journey she had to take. It was not a place for hesitation, nor a path to be avoided. It was the next step. She approached the bridge slowly, her footsteps muffled on the soft earth. The closer she got, the more she could feel the pull of the bridge's energy, as if it were calling her forward, urging her to cross. There was no hesitation in her heart, only a quiet certainty. This was the path, the bridge between what was and what could be, a threshold that separated her past from the future that awaited her. The ravine below the bridge was vast, its depth hidden in shadow, the dark expanse stretching endlessly below her. Yet, she did not feel fear. The bridge, with its stone surface, felt solid beneath her feet. Each step she took was deliberate, measured, as if she were walking on a threshold not just between worlds, but between all the parts of herself she had yet to fully understand. As Evelyn crossed, the air seemed to change, becoming thicker with each step. It was as though the very atmosphere was charged with energy, carrying the weight of the past and the promise of the future in its current. The bridge seemed to vibrate with every footfall, reverberating through the very core of her being, as if it were not merely a passage of stone but a living thing, breathing with her. And then, as she reached the center of the bridge, something extraordinary happened. The sky above her began to shift. The clouds, once still, began to swirl, forming shapes that Evelyn couldn't comprehend. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and earth, and the light, which had once been gentle, grew brighter, more intense. The fabric of reality itself seemed to bend as if the very world were coming undone. She stopped in her tracks, feeling the ground beneath her tremble, the bridge swaying ever so slightly, as though the world around her were taking a deep breath before the plunge into something unknown. Evelyn closed her eyes, steadying herself against the surge of energy that flowed through her. She could hear the wind whispering in her ears, its words unintelligible yet familiar. The vibrations in the bridge pulsed beneath her feet, resonating deep in her chest. The light that had guided her so far was now blinding, enveloping her in a warmth she couldn't escape. The ravine below, once dark and shadowed, was now filled with a golden radiance, its depths illuminated by the same light that filled the air. For a moment, she felt herself lifted, as though she were floating between worlds, neither here nor there, caught in the nexus of all that had come before and all that was yet to come. Her heart beat in rhythm with the pulse of the world, and she felt herself slip into a kind of trance, her body no longer bound by the laws of time and space. The light, the energy, the very air seemed to swirl around her, wrapping her in its embrace, drawing her forward. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the tumultuous energy faded. The light softened, the swirling clouds above her dissipated, and the air grew still. The bridge stopped vibrating, and Evelyn found herself standing at the far side of the ravine, the stone beneath her feet solid and unwavering once more. The sky was clear again, the world around her peaceful, and the light once more gentle. She had crossed the bridge. Before her now lay a new landscape. The forest behind her seemed a distant memory, its trees fading into the horizon. The ground ahead was open and vast, stretching into an infinite expanse. There was no end in sight, only the soft contours of hills, the endless stretch of earth, and the rising sun, its light casting a soft glow across the land. Evelyn paused, taking in the beauty of this new place. She could feel the connection, deep within her, between herself and this land. The bridge had not only carried her across the ravine, but it had also bridged the gap between the parts of herself she had yet to understand. Her journey was not over. It had only just begun. And so, with a steady breath, Evelyn stepped forward into the unknown, her heart calm, her spirit open to whatever came next. The bridge had shown her that there was no separation between the worlds, that all things were connected. And as she moved forward, she knew she was not walking alone. She was part of the earth, part of the light, part of the vastness that stretched out before her. The bridge between worlds had been crossed, and Evelyn had become something more. Chapter 16. The Constellations We Wove. The world around Evelyn was silent, almost too quiet. After crossing the bridge, she had entered a land that seemed untouched, pristine in its stillness. There were no sounds of birds, no rustle of leaves in the wind, only the distant hum of the earth's heartbeat. The air was thick with an ancient peace, as though the land itself had held its breath for centuries, waiting for something. She could feel it, a deep, trembling undercurrent that seemed to pass beneath the surface of everything. The moment she had stepped onto this land, something had shifted, as though the world itself had awoken from a long, dreamless sleep. Evelyn walked slowly, her footsteps soft against the dew-covered grass. The terrain before her was unfamiliar, an expanse of rolling hills and vast, empty fields. The earth stretched out endlessly, the edges of the land blurred by the soft mist that hung in the air. Trees stood in sparse clusters, their branches reaching toward the sky, their leaves a rich, dark green, full of vitality. The sun above her was still low in the sky, casting long, golden beams across the land. But there was a heaviness to the light, a weight, a warning that lingered just beneath the surface. She had crossed the bridge, but now there was nowhere to go, no clear direction to follow. The path ahead was open and unmarked. The land before her stretched wide with no boundaries, no lines to guide her. Evelyn paused, standing at the edge of a ridge that overlooked a valley below. The valley was filled with fog, thick and heavy, like a blanket that smothered the life beneath it. The sight sent a ripple of unease through her, though she couldn't quite place the source of her discomfort. The silence was overwhelming, and she could feel it pressing in on her, the air thick with anticipation. The ground beneath her feet seemed solid, yet it held a strange energy, something that pulled at her, like a magnet drawing her closer to something she could not yet see. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, trying to center herself. The piece of the land felt fragile, and yet she knew deep within her that there was something more to it, something hidden in its depths. The land wasn't just still, it was waiting. She began to walk again, each step slow, deliberate. Her senses were heightened now, as though the world had sharpened around her, each detail more vivid, more alive than before. The grass beneath her feet felt cool and damp, the ground soft, almost yielding. The smell of earth and the subtle fragrance of wildflowers filled her lungs. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, every breath a reminder that she was here, now, in this moment. And yet, there was something in the air that unsettled her, something not quite right. As she descended into the valley, the fog thickened, swirling around her feet like a living thing, curling up in tendrils that brushed against her skin. The mist carried a chill that crept into her bones, but it wasn't the kind of cold that came from the air alone. No, it was a cold that seemed to seep from the ground, from the earth itself. The mist seemed to be alive, its tendrils shifting and coiling, moving in unnatural patterns. Evelyn could sense that she was not alone in this valley. The silence around her deepened, becoming oppressive, and yet the sensation of being watched lingered at the back of her mind. She could feel eyes upon her, though there was no one in sight. Every step she took, the fog seemed to shift with her, swirling around her legs like a living thing. The valley felt vast, but somehow closed in, the walls of mist pressing in, narrowing her focus. There was no escape from it, no way to outrun it. She walked for what seemed like hours, the mist growing denser, the air heavier. Every now and then, she thought she saw something in the fog, a shadow passing in the corner of her eye, a movement just beyond her reach. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there, only the endless expanse of the mist. The world felt distorted, the edges of reality bending in ways she couldn't explain. She reached out a hand, feeling for something solid, but all she could grasp was the cold, damp air. Her heart began to race as she pushed forward, her breath coming in short bursts. The pull within her chest grew stronger, more urgent, but she couldn't discern its source. She was being drawn deeper into the valley, into the fog, and there was no turning back now. Her steps were automatic, her body moving with a purpose she couldn't fully understand. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the mist parted. Before her stood a dark, towering figure, tall, gaunt, its form indistinct in the shifting shadows of the valley. The figure loomed over her, blocking her path, its presence like a wall, impenetrable and cold. Evelyn stopped, frozen in place, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching her with unseen eyes. The air around her grew still, the fog swirling in tight circles around the figure's feet, as though it was part of it. Evelyn took a tentative step forward, but the figure did not retreat. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy, an ancient power that reverberated through the very ground beneath her. The weight of its presence pressed in on her, suffocating, like a storm about to break. And yet, there was a strange sense of familiarity, as though she had encountered this presence before, or had known it in some distant, forgotten memory. She reached out with her senses, trying to understand what it was, what it meant. And then, in that moment of stillness, she felt it, an echo, a whisper carried on the wind. It was a voice, not one that she could hear with her ears, but one she could feel within her very soul. The voice was ancient, filled with the weight of centuries, and it spoke not in words, but in feelings, in memories long buried. The figure before her began to fade, the shadows shifting and dissipating into the fog. The mist began to swirl around her again, but now it seemed different. It was no longer oppressive, no longer a trap. It was a guide, leading her forward. She could feel it pulling her, urging her to continue, to move deeper into the heart of the valley. The figure, now a memory, left a lingering presence in the air. A promise, a warning. Evelyn took another step, her heart steady now, the weight of the world lifting from her shoulders. The valley was no longer a place of dread. It was a threshold, a passage that led to something greater. The silence was no longer an enemy. It was the calm before the storm, the stillness that would soon give way to the power of what lay ahead. With a steady breath, Evelyn continued on her path, knowing that the journey was far from over. And whatever storm awaited her in the distance, she would face it, as she always had, head on, with strength in her heart and the world beneath her feet. Chapter 17. Rainfall on Burning Coals. The landscape had shifted once again, though it was subtle, imperceptible to the untrained eye, yet undeniable to Evelyn. The air had grown heavier, colder, and the once distant hum beneath the earth had become a rhythm she could almost hear. It wasn't the wind or the rustling of the trees. It was deeper, like the pulse of something that lay dormant beneath the surface, a force that had always been there, waiting. The land now felt like a living, breathing thing, its very essence vibrating with a quiet intensity. Evelyn walked with a renewed sense of purpose, her feet moving steadily across the uneven terrain. The fog had dissipated, but the world before her had grown darker, the light from the fading sun stretching out long shadows over the land. The trees, once vibrant with life, had begun to show signs of decay. Dry leaves that crumbled to dust at the lightest touch, branches twisted and knotted, as though the earth itself had begun to wither. Yet there was something beautiful in the decay, an undeniable truth that this land, this place, was both living and dying in the same breath. It was a paradox, one that Evelyn couldn't quite understand, but it stirred something deep within her, an ancient knowing. She glanced up toward the sky, where the last vestiges of daylight were slipping away, the heavens painted in hues of violet and deep blue. The stars had already begun to blink into existence, distant pinpricks of light that seemed to observe her journey with quiet patience. But there was no longer a sense of urgency in her step. Time had become irrelevant here. The day had faded into night, yet Evelyn felt as though she had moved beyond time itself, as though she had entered a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The trees had begun to thin out, and ahead of her, the land opened up to reveal a wide expanse, a vast, desolate plain that stretched as far as the eye could see. The ground here was cracked and dry, a barren wasteland where the remnants of a once thriving landscape now lay in ruin. Scattered across the plain were the remnants of long-forgotten structures, crumbling stone walls, broken archways, and shattered columns, all consumed by the relentless passage of time. The ruins seemed ancient, their purpose lost to history, but Evelyn could sense that they had once been something of great significance, something that had been abandoned, left to rot in the shadow of what had come before. Her footsteps grew softer as she walked through the ruins, her breath steady but shallow, her senses heightened as the darkness deepened around her. The wind had picked up again, but it was different now. Stronger, more insistent, carrying with it the scent of something distant, something that stirred memories long buried. The air tasted of salt and earth, and there was a strange tang to it, as though something was about to change. Something was waiting just beyond the horizon. It was then that she saw it. At first, it was a flicker, a flash of movement at the edge of her vision, but when she turned her head, there was nothing there. The sensation lingered, however, a strange pull, an unseen force tugging at her heart. She tried to ignore it, to push forward, but the feeling remained, growing stronger with each passing step. It was like a whisper just beyond her reach, a soft murmur that echoed through the emptiness. She could feel it now, this presence, watching her, following her every movement. It was not malevolent, not threatening, but it was persistent, an unrelenting force that refused to let her go. She could not see it, but she could feel its eyes on her, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Her heart began to race, and she quickened her pace, but the presence kept pace with her, as though it were always one step behind, just out of sight. Evelyn felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change in the air around her. The wind began to howl, whipping through the ruins, sending dust and debris into the air. The sky above her darkened, the stars fading into a dull, featureless blackness. The land had grown still, unnaturally still, as though it was holding its breath. And then, as though summoned by the stillness, the figure appeared. At first, it was a shape in the distance, a silhouette, tall and imposing, its form shrouded in shadows. As it moved closer, the details became clearer. The figure was clad in dark, flowing robes, the edges of which seemed to blend into the darkness around it, as though it were part of the very night itself. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Evelyn could feel its gaze piercing through the veil of darkness, locking onto her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. The figure moved toward her, its steps measured, deliberate, the sound of its feet on the cracked earth almost inaudible. It didn't hurry, didn't need to. There was no fear in its movements, no hesitation. It was as though it knew that Evelyn would not escape, that there was nowhere to run, no place to hide. She stood frozen, watching as it came closer, a sense of inevitability settling over her. And then, just as it was within arm's reach, the figure stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. The wind had died down, the air thick with an oppressive silence. The figure stood there, still as stone, and Evelyn could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on her. It didn't speak, didn't move. It simply stood, watching her, waiting. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps, her chest rising and falling in quick succession. She had no words, no explanation for the fear that gripped her heart. It wasn't fear of the figure itself, but of what it represented, what it was a part of. This land, this place, was not a place of peace. It was a place of endings, a place where the light faded, where things were forgotten, lost to time. And now, standing before her, was the embodiment of that loss. The figure was a part of the darkness, a keeper of the space between life and death, a guardian of the memories that had been erased. Evelyn stood before it, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had experienced, everything she had lost. The figure seemed to recognize her hesitation, the uncertainty that lingered in her chest. It was not an enemy, not an obstacle. It was a reminder, a reflection of the past that could never be reclaimed. The stillness stretched on, each passing second like an eternity. The wind picked up again, though it was gentler now, carrying with it the scent of rain. And then, as though it had never been there, the figure faded into the darkness, its form dissolving into the shadows. Evelyn stood alone once more, the land around her silent and still. The air felt different now, lighter, less oppressive. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered in the depths of her mind, a reminder of what had been and what could never be again. The journey was far from over, but Evelyn knew that she had reached a turning point, a threshold that would change everything. She took a steady breath and continued forward, her steps resolute, the fading light of the day casting long shadows across the ground. The world around her was shifting, changing, and though she didn't know what lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain. She would face it, as she had faced everything before, with courage and determination in her heart. Chapter 18. Where Eternity Begins. The journey had stretched endlessly before her, a winding path woven through moments of unbearable silence and the quiet symphony of a world too vast to understand. Evelyn's legs were heavy now, worn down by the miles, by the days that seemed to blend together, each one indistinguishable from the last. The sun, though still absent from the sky, sent a faint pulse of warmth through the land, a pale shadow of the life it once gave. It was almost as if the earth itself was sighing, caught between the realms of memory and the undeniable truth of the present. Evelyn's feet pressed firmly into the ground, each step a reminder of how far she had come, how much had been left behind. She was tired, yes, but there was something else, something deeper. She could feel it now, the weight of everything she had learned, everything she had seen. Her heart, though worn thin, beat with a steady rhythm, a quiet determination that spoke of a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. This journey was not just a passage through the world. It was a passage through herself, through the pieces of her soul she had long ago buried, discarded, and forgotten. The wind had shifted, as it often did, carrying with it the familiar scent of earth and salt. The atmosphere around her hummed with a quiet urgency, as though the land itself was drawing in a final breath, ready to release what had been held in its depths for so long. The trees that had once surrounded her, so dark, so consuming, were now thinning, retreating, leaving an open space before her. Ahead, the land began to rise, the gentle slope of a hill leading her towards something distant, something unknown. And there, at the crest of the hill, was the fire. Evelyn had not expected to see it, not in this place, not in this barren, forgotten world. Yet it burned brightly, a vibrant, orange glow that cut through the encroaching darkness. It was not a flame that flickered in the wind, weak and unsure. No, this fire was steady, its light warm and radiant, casting shadows that danced on the ground before her. There was no smoke, no stench of burning. It was a fire that burned without consuming, that seemed to hold in its flames the essence of life itself. She stood at the base of the hill, gazing up at the fire, her heart quickening with a mixture of awe and unease. There was something undeniably familiar about it, as though she had seen it before in a dream, or perhaps in a memory long buried. She felt drawn to it, but also hesitant, as though it were a temptation she could not afford. The fire, she knew, held the power to change everything, to give something back or take it away, depending on the choice she made. As she climbed the hill, her mind raced with thoughts that made no sense and yet felt so true. She had come so far. There had been moments when she thought the end was near, moments when the path ahead seemed lost to the darkness. But she had always moved forward, step by step, finding the courage to keep going, even when the world around her seemed to fall apart. She had seen the ruins of the past, the remnants of things that could never be reclaimed. She had witnessed the figure, felt its watchful gaze, and yet had remained resolute in her pursuit of whatever lay ahead. Now, standing at the top of the hill, she could see the full extent of the fire. It burned in the center of a great circle, its flames swirling in perfect harmony, creating a pattern that seemed both ancient and new. The ground around it was scorched, the earth cracked and broken. But there was a beauty to it, a strange serenity that came from the understanding that fire could both destroy and renew. Evelyn approached cautiously, feeling the heat of the flames wash over her, but not burning her. It was a warmth she hadn't known in a long time, a comfort that seemed to pull at something deep within her. She stood just outside the circle, gazing into the fire, unsure of what she was meant to do, what this final trial was supposed to mean. It was then that she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, as if the world itself was speaking to her. It was the whisper of the wind, the sigh of the trees, the heartbeat of the earth. And in that whisper, she understood. The fire had always been there, waiting. It was not a force that would be tamed or controlled. It was a part of the land, a part of life, a part of the inevitable cycle that had begun long before her and would continue long after. The flames spoke of endings and beginnings, of the eternal dance between light and dark. They were not a warning, nor a promise, but a truth, one that she had known all along, deep in her bones, even if she had not fully understood it. Her breath caught as she stepped closer to the fire, the heat intensifying around her. But it did not burn her. Instead, it embraced her, wrapping her in a cocoon of warmth and light. She felt something inside her shift, a part of her that had been lost now finding its place. The weight of her journey, the weight of all she had carried, began to dissolve, as if the fire itself was taking it from her. She could feel her heart slowing, the frantic pulse of fear that had guided her through the darkness now replaced with a calmness that filled her from within. The fire flickered, sending sparks into the air, and Evelyn closed her eyes, allowing the warmth to fill every corner of her being. She felt the earth beneath her feet, the solid ground that had supported her all this time. She felt the wind on her face, the reminder that she was still part of something greater than herself. The fire was not an end. It was a beginning, a birth from the ashes of the past. When she opened her eyes again, the fire had begun to die down, its flames now a gentle glow, soft and inviting. The circle around it had been transformed, the scorched earth now vibrant with new life. The trees that had once retreated now stood tall once more, their branches reaching toward the sky as though they, too, had been reborn. The land, once barren and empty, was now a place of renewal, of promise. And Evelyn knew, as she stood there watching the fire fade into embers, that her journey had come full circle. She had faced the darkness, walked through the ruins, and stood before the fire of truth. And now, she was ready to begin again. The last embers glowed softly in the night, a quiet reminder that everything ends and everything begins in its own time.